I just want to reiterate, thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that personal story. I think that brings home for why we're here and what we're doing, right? So again, thank you. Our next speaker is Tara Cohen. She's a registered social worker and mindfulness instructor and is deeply committed to supporting people in achieving their optimal quality of life through their life journey. In addition to working as a grief therapist at Andrea Warnick Consulting and Tara Cohen Wellness, Tara works in the health systems planning at the Champlain Hospice Palliative Care Program, where she supports hospice, hospital, long-term care, and community organizations to develop palliative and end-of-life programs. Tara's hope is to respond to the needs and suffering of individuals, families, and healthcare teams as they walk their unique and collective paths through life, including illness, dying, death, and grief. Welcome, Tara.
Thanks for the introduction, Lee.
You're welcome.
Chelsea, can you tell me which button to push?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I hope everyone's doing all right. I know it's the end of the day, and I'm here to sort of, spend some time with you just talking about grief. So I thank you, Jennifer, honestly, for sharing your story, and I think we're all feeling emotional. My hope was to do a short practice just to sort of help ground us, and I think we're probably needing the grounding after, hearing your story, and I very much appreciate hearing about your mom and the beautiful picture. So if we all just want to take a couple of minutes and just start by, bringing ourselves back to this place, this moment. So I invite you, if it feels comfortable to you, to close your eyes. Feel free to do that. If you prefer to keep them open, that works too. Just taking a couple of minutes to, start by noticing your feet on the floor. We're going to try to get out of our heads, get into our bodies just a little bit for a couple of moments. So noticing your feet on the ground, perhaps the backs of your legs on the chair, having your body straight without being stiff, head above shoulders, and just allowing the body to breathe. And there's no need to speed up your breathing or slow it down. Just allowing the body to breathe at a comfortable pace for you. And breathing in, just knowing that you're breathing in. And breathing out, just knowing that you're breathing out. You may choose to notice where the breath feels most prominent for you. So if you're noticing it at your nostrils, or the rise and fall of your chest, or the expansion and contraction of your belly, just noticing that and being with that. You may choose to say something quietly in your own mind. Breathing in, I calm my body. And breathing out, I calm my mind. If that feels comfortable for you. And taking a few final breaths here. And when you're feeling ready, perhaps moving your hands and feet, maybe your head side to side a little bit. If your eyes are closed, when it feels right, reopening them, bringing your awareness back to the space. Okay, thanks everyone. I hope everyone's feeling a little more settled, a little more connected to themselves. I have a few objectives, I guess, that I'm hoping to achieve here today in talking about grief. So the first is, just discussing some of the language around grief and grieving, get us all on the same page. I know there are lots of different definitions that are out there for some of the common words that we use. The second is to talk a little bit about emotions, enhance our ability to connect with what it is we're feeling. Sometimes it's challenging to know what it is we're feeling and to name it, but we'll talk about that a little bit. And the third is to look at compassion as a strategy. So mindfulness and/or compassion as a strategy to support ourselves while we're grieving. So while we're sort of going through this information, I guess I just wanted to say a couple of things before we get into it, which is my role at the Champlain Hospice Palliative Care Program is generally to support healthcare teams to notice what's happening in terms of their own experience, working with people who are experiencing life-limiting illnesses and dying. So just connecting with themselves, supporting themselves as individuals, but also thinking themselves as healthcare professionals and also supporting their colleagues, right? So being there as teams together. And also in turn, develop or enhance or make them feel more confident in their skills to support their patients, clients, residents. So I work across sectors. You might notice I switch around. I like people best, but it doesn't always fit. So sometimes I will, I might throw in residents or clients or patients, depending on what it is I'm talking about. And then I also work very often with volunteers. So I work in the community sector as well, supporting teams of volunteers to be able to do grief and bereavement work. So going out into the community and either doing one-on-one visiting or sometimes grief support groups. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit interesting, but we're going to try it out. So dying and death euphemisms. So we tend to use euphemisms in our language all the time. And I think it's not going to be hard for us in 15 seconds or so to come up with euphemisms that we see, that we've used ourselves, that we hear around dying and death. So hopefully we'll come up with some really quickly, 15, 20 seconds. Okay, so dying and death euphemism. Kick the bucket, thank you.
Okay, we'll just keep it like this.
Thank you. Return to Mother Earth. Okay, I'll try to repeat them. I just realized I should do that. Okay. Anyone else? Passing away. I'd say that's probably the one we hear the most, right? Someone passed away. It feels more gentle than somebody died. Okay. Crossed over. Yes. Rainbow Bridge. Bought the farm. Thank you. Lost. Yeah, we often lose people. Yeah. Okay. Bit the dust. Okay. Yes, someone has bit the dust. Yes, in the back. Croaked. Haven't heard that one in a while. Okay, croaked. Chelsea, any others that you just want to in the chat box that might be like different?
Nope.
No, people are quiet in the chat box. Okay, go ahead. Went to sleep. Yeah, that one's super confusing for kids, right? Yeah, okay.
Palliative.
Palliative. Yeah, so even palliative, we're not exactly sure sometimes what that means, right? Okay, so thank you. So as you can see, that was really, really short. If we took 2 minutes, we would come up with so many different ways to avoid using the word died or dying. And I'm not here to suggest that when you're connecting with your clients, residents, patients, that you use language that feels uncomfortable for them. But I think it's important for us, as healthcare professionals or volunteers, to think about the words and the language that we're using, right? So ourselves agents, right? That we could be out there and, there's a lot of discussion around our society being a death denying society. And I think these euphemisms are part of that, right? That we've tried to distance ourselves from the actual illness, dying and death. So finding the right opportunities, right? To use these words to, maybe make our kids or our kids, or our friends' children or, the next generations more comfortable with these words so that we could bring conversations about dying into our everyday lives.
Tara,
Yeah.
can you just, when you go through, just read your slides? We keep getting disconnected from the internet,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's what you're
Yeah.
hearing.
Okay.
So we're just not going to, every time we screen share, that's when we get disconnected.
Got it.
So if you can just read the slides, that way
I can
everyone
read the
online.
slides. Okay.
Okay.
It's funny because I always have lots of slides and I often ignore them. So I will try. I will try. So, okay. So we're going to get into some definitions, language. I think it's important, right? That we're all sort of speaking about the same thing. I hope this is useful for everybody. So a few definitions just around, around illness, dying, death, grief. So the first one, what is grief? I like this. I think it, it kind of resonates with me. The Latin word for grief is the Latin word, grief comes from the Latin word gravis, and gravis literally means heavy. And I think that says so much, right? So we feel, we often have that sense of feeling so heavy when we're experiencing grief. Grief is our natural response to the death of somebody close to us. So there's even loss in the slide. Maybe I should take the word loss out after. But and I guess what else I wanted to say about grief is generally, when we talk about grief, we're talking about our own internal response to illness, dying, change of situation. Grief isn't only about dying and death. It's also, we know we grieve many different situations. So it could be loss of a job or divorce or, incarceration of somebody we care about, or some of the, there are many different things that induce grief. But for today, we're talking specifically around illness and dying. But it generally is our own physical response, our own internal response. So it could be physical, it could be spiritual, it could be psychological, it could be sexual, it could be all these different things that we experience individually. I wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about disenfranchised grief, because for me, it's really important when I'm working in with healthcare teams. This is what I see the most. So disenfranchised grief is really the failure of others to acknowledge or recognize an individual's grief. Disenfranchised grief is often hidden, and I see it in healthcare environments all the time, that there's this sense of, we have chosen this work and we're not entitled to feel the feelings that we feel. Right? So there could be shame, there could be embarrassment, there could be a sense of that it's not professional to let my feelings hang out. And my experience, that's really contributed to a sense of loneliness and isolation, and possibly all of this burnout that we're seeing in healthcare is not being able to have our experience acknowledged, right? And I don't need to tell you, I think you are all working or engaged in different ways in healthcare or in volunteering with people and taking care of people. That grief is a full human response reaction. And if it goes acknowledged, if we're burying it, if we're putting it on a shelf, if we're not attending to it, it doesn't disappear. Right? It doesn't just poof and magically go away. It's just sitting there waiting to usually wreak some kind of havoc. Did I miss one there? I just wanted to give a brief mention of complicated or prolonged grief. The language around complicated grief is shifting to more of prolonged grief. And what that really is just grief that doesn't progress. And I share that with a little bit of hesitation, because I don't want anyone to get out of my talk here today that grief has a particular timeline. Grief is what it is, and it takes the time it takes. But generally, there is a shifting of the experience of grieving. In complicated or prolonged grief, we'll see that people are sort of in one spot for a long period of time, right? And they report that they feel like they can't function at all. And sometimes the grieving process can be complicated by some of these things that are on the slide. It could be complicated by depression or substance use, other like chronic health problems, or ongoing losses, ongoing situations of loss. That makes it more difficult to progress. So those are just a few things. There are other parts of grief we could talk about, but we don't have a lot of time today. But I do, there's anticipatory grief. There's, different elements of grief that are also important that I just didn't address today. I wanted to talk for a second about mourning. So the definition of mourning that sort of speaks to me that I like to share is that mourning is our public face of grief. It's what we bring out into the world to sort of demonstrate to people that we've experienced the death or the death of somebody close to us. So that's often seen in rituals, funerals, burial rites, memorial services. Could be other things depending on your culture and your traditions, but those are some of the common ones. And then bereavement, again, Latin, the Latin words. So reeve comes from the Latin, it's the Latin word, and it means to split, tear, or break apart, which I think is also kind of cool, right? Like bereavement, when I talk about bereavement, I share, like, the most important part to me is bereavement encompasses both grief, which is our internal response, and mourning, which is our external expression. So bereavement it's everything all together. So this slide, I don't know if people online can see it. Or people,
No.
no, people can't see it. Okay, so this is gonna be really hard. So, okay, so basically there's a slide up that shows how we want grief to work, and we want it to be a straight line, right? We want grief to be predictable. The other half of the slide shows how grief actually works, and it's a big messy ball of tangled up yarn. So I think in our culture, or many of our cultures, we like knowing, we like control, right? So I think many of us sort of like want to know what's the plan. Maybe many of us grew up in the days of, discussion around Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the stages of grieving, which, I like to share, was kind of misrepresented. Kubler-Ross's work was fantastic, but it was initially meant, the stages were meant to reflect people themselves who are dying, the stages that they experienced, not so much the stages of people experiencing grief. So yeah, but I think we have this idea in our minds that things are linear. If I do this and I do that, and I do the next thing, I'll be recovered. And I really don't like the term around grief recovery. So I talk more about integrating grief into our experience. I don't think that we recover. I think it becomes part of who we are after we've experienced grief, right? We're forever changed. It's not like we go back to the person we were before. We've changed. So I have a question for you, and I'll read it out for the people that are participating virtually. So the question is, when I am experiencing grief, I prefer to. So here in the room, I'll read out the first one, and if this reflects you when you're grieving, feel free to put your hand up. Online, you can put a number 1, if or a number 2. I'll tell you what to put. So when I am experiencing grief, I prefer to be alone. So here in the room, okay, we have maybe a fifth of the people. So online, if you like to be alone, you can throw a number 1 in the chat box, just so you have a sense that there are other people out there that like to be alone too.
I've got a couple of ones.
A couple of ones, okay. So how about number 2? Do you like to talk to a friend? Show of hands if you like to talk to a friend. Okay, again, maybe a fifth of the people. How about online? We have any number 2s? Okay, a few online too. Okay, how about number 3? Do something creative. You could pick 2, absolutely. Yeah, we are multifaceted. Absolutely. So number 3, do something creative. Art, journaling. Okay, well, we have only a couple here. Do we have any creative people online?
No.
No, nobody creative online. Number 4, physical activity. Go for a run, a workout. Okay, maybe more than a fifth. Yeah, maybe like a quarter. Any physical people online? Yeah, okay.
3, 4.
And then number 5, if you have something completely different, feel free to throw it in the chat box if you have something completely different that you do when you're grieving, or here in the room if anybody wants to share something different. And go into nature. Yeah, that's a really good one. It's a nice one. Thank you. I don't know if you said it, but crying. Yeah, thank you. Feeling your feelings. Okay, crying.
We've got a few for listening to music and meditating. Music,
meditation. Excellent. Yeah, so my point in this is really just for an acknowledgement that there's no right way, there's no wrong way. We are all different. And, to approach each other as healthcare teams, as families, as friends, as colleagues, to approach each other with compassion and understanding that my way of grief might not be your way of grief. And learning to ask questions, right? Not making assumptions, but say what makes you feel better when you're grieving? Is there something I could do with you that feels good? Can I do that with you? But asking those questions. We're not going to get too far into this, but I did want to mention it because I think it's really valuable when we're experiencing grief to think about our warning signs, right? So I think, some days when we're grieving, we feel okay. And then we might experience a big grief burst. We might, hear a song or smell a smell or go into the grocery store and see something that, the person who has died would have loved, or, and we might have a grief burst. But then also we have times where we're just not coping so well. So thinking about what our warning signs might be, right? And we're doing that as a way, I consider that mindfulness. Mindfulness to me is really about, a big part of it is just noticing. So developing the skills and learning to ask ourselves these kinds of questions, right? What's coming up? So maybe your warning signs are something that you're feeling in your body. Maybe you're holding your breath, or maybe you're feeling pain in your shoulders or your jaw. But it could be things like, I often share that my Netflix gets out of control. So way more than normal. And I have a colleague, you know, who sometimes I do these kinds of sessions with. She's at the School of Social Work at Carleton, and she talks about her bulk barn, like her bulk barn buying, the big bags full of stuff. So I don't know. So we're not going to, you know, I hope you take some time to sort of think about what your warning signs might be. And the reason for that is so you could care for yourselves, or, you know, get some additional support, do things that feel good to you. So let's talk about emotions. I'm curious in this room and online, how many people like feeling their feelings? If you like to feel your feelings, raise your hand. Okay, so I know it's hard online to reflect, but I don't know how many people are in this room, 40-ish? 40-ish, I think 2 people raised their hands. So, and that's really quite reflective of what I see most times. Most people, interestingly, we just don't like to feel our feelings, right? And I hear people talk about, like, you know, good feelings and good emotions, bad emotions. So I try to share, like, feelings aren't inherently good or bad, right? So if we could shift our language a little bit to, like, we have feelings that we like to feel, we have feelings we don't like to feel. But the reality is, and maybe, you know, our mothers, our fathers, somebody did us wrong along the way, trying to tell us that we should always be happy, that, you know, we should always feel good. There's no real evidence for that. Like, we are full human beings and we do this full spectrum. So what I'm going to suggest to you, and this is like Tara Brock, who's a meditation person, she talks about radical acceptance. I would share that we really need to practice just being with whatever we're feeling, even if we don't like it. So Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist, he has an expression, name it to tame it. So we're talking about on the slide here, naming emotions promotes experiencing them, and then we can name it to tame it. So he says, if we can become more comfortable at actually naming our feelings. So on the slide, I have a picture of Plutchik's wheel of emotion. There are lots of different emotion wheels out there. I happen to like Plutchik's wheel of emotion. Plutchik was a psychologist. And this particular emotion wheel has eight primary emotions in the second ring. So not the ring in the very center, but there's a second ring. So as humans, we have 8 primary emotions, and all of the other emotions sort of stem out from there. But in these flower petals, the circle in the middle has the most intense form of the emotion. And then as the flower petals extend out, it's the same emotion in decreasing intensity. That was a long explanation just to share with you. I think it's really useful to get an emotion wheel and start to look at some of the labels, or to get a list of feelings and look at the labels and just practice it, right? Because we might notice that we're feeling things in our body and not even know what we're feeling. But sometimes we could look at a list of words, angry, sad, discouraged, you know, disheartened, like all of these different words that we might not think, but when we see it, we're like, yes, you know, it just resonates. Yes, I think that's what I'm feeling. And then going back to Dan Siegel, the psychiatrist, the name it to tame it. So he says, if you could identify the emotion and say it out loud, and maybe say it a bunch of times out loud, that reduces the hold that feeling has over us. So when I first learned that, it was back in 2014, I was recently divorced. I literally walked around the house saying, I feel freaking miserable, you know, for like a week or whatever, you know, or I feel so happy, or I feel so liberated, or I feel like trying all these different words out and just seeing what changed in my body, what changed in my mood. And it was really, you know, it was a really neat experience. So I offer it up as an idea for you to give it a try. Just try saying it out loud, seeing how it feels, seeing how you feel after playing around with it for a little bit. How are we doing for time? Good. We're okay? Yeah. Wonderful. So I wanted to talk a little bit about compassion and self-compassion. What I've noticed working with healthcare providers and volunteers, really easy to be compassionate towards other people. There seems to be this ongoing flow and abundance of compassion for people. Self-compassion seems to be a little more challenging. So I guess before I get into that, I want to just talk a little bit about empathy, and, you know, versus compassion. So I think there's a little bit of confusion. There's been a movement, you know, I think in part of the burnout literature where we talk about compassion fatigue. More recently, there's scientific literature that's looked at, so Tanya Singer, she's a German psychiatrist, or maybe she's a medical doctor. Well, I guess psychiatrists are medical doctors. So anyway, she's done a lot of research using MRIs and fMRIs to look at the different parts of the brain that are activated when we're using empathy versus using compassion. So it's actually different parts of the brain that are utilized in those different skill sets. And what she has shared is that really what we experience is empathy fatigue, not compassion fatigue. Empathy, what happens with empathy is that we feel with another person, right? We're putting, like, I think that just the definition we often hear of empathy is to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And when we do that, we are basically living their experience, and that can lead to our own kind of depletion, especially if we don't have good boundaries. With compassion, we're not putting ourselves in their shoes. We're extending good wishes or good feelings or love towards them. And the evidence is showing that there's no end to that. It doesn't deplete us. It's ongoing, and there's all sorts of reserves there. So I think it's important just to note the difference, right? Especially as people who are caring for others who are, sick or dying, or, when we're supporting people who are grieving, is to, to work with those different skills. So I wanted to speak specifically around self-compassion, and this is the work that I'm going to share here. It's the work of Kristen Neff, N-E-F-F, if you're interested in looking more at self-compassion literature. So it's Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer. They're North American researchers who've done a lot of work in self-compassion. And they talk about these three domains as being, the different parts of self-compassion. So they say the first element is mindfulness. So the reason that we need mindfulness in self-compassion is because we need to check in with ourselves, right? We can't be compassionate towards ourselves if we don't know what we're experiencing. So mindfulness, I'll give you my favorite definition of it. It's funny because people say things to me like mindfulness is airy-fairy or hokey-dokey. I say mindfulness in its barest form. Mindfulness is noticing. But John Kabat-Zinn, he started the MBSR program, so mindfulness-based stress reduction, and he started it at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. So he started working with mindfulness with patients who were experiencing chronic pain. They had been through all the medical treatments they can, but even, when all treatment was exhausted, they still experienced medical pain. They still experienced physical pain. So he turned to mindfulness to see if he could help them work with their pain. So he says mindfulness is paying attention on purpose in a particular way, moment by moment, non-judgmentally. So it's kind of a lot, but I'll say it again, just to see if it hits somewhere. So mindfulness is paying attention on purpose in a particular way, moment by moment, non-judgmentally. So the reason I think this is important when we're talking about grief is to be with our discomfort, or to be with whatever it is that's coming up moment by moment, and not judging our experience is really, I'd say it's important, and it's important because that's going to help support your ongoing resiliency and well-being, right? So to not judge it, right? So that goes back to when I talk about disenfranchised grief. Some of the healthcare workers I work with, when they're like, I shouldn't be feeling this, I hear a lot of shouldn'ts, right? So we're not going to judge the experience. This is what it is. I'm just going to hold it. I'm going to be with it. I'm going to notice it. And then also this idea of seeing how it changes, because we know feelings, going back to our feelings don't last forever. They come and go, right? So mindfulness gives us these skills and the ability to see what's there and to see when and how it changes. The second part is around self-kindness. It seems pretty evident. Self-kindness is really treating yourself kindly the way you would treat a cherished person in your life. But it's amazing how difficult it is to do, right? When we're suffering, when we're going through a hard time, to not beat ourselves up. So the skill here is really around, and we sometimes, back in the days when we used to do lots of these things in person, but even online, we had these little self-kindness cards. Can you write a 6-word story about treating yourself kindly? So a 6-word story, it's really short. It's just 6 words. It doesn't have to be any literary work of art, but it's going to be a reminder when you're really struggling or suffering or feeling crummy or overwhelmed to pull out your 6-word story. You know, it could be like sit by the water and enjoy. It could be drink a cup of tea, you know, drink a cup of tea with the dog. I don't know, but you know, these are skills that hopefully you could take forward. These are things that you could, you know, try out to see if they support you when you're grieving. And then the third element to self-compassion that Neff and Germer talk about that happens to be my favorite one, especially during the pandemic when we've all been apart and separate and feeling lonely a lot of the time potentially. So common humanity refers to knowing we are not alone, right? So likely whatever we're experiencing, you know, if it's huge turnover in our hospital, or if it's the death of somebody close to us, or if it's watching the suffering of a family, like knowing that we're not alone in that. There are other people who are likely experiencing something similar or the same thing, you know, likely in that moment. So being able to connect, right? Not feeling like we're just floating out there alone in the world. So this is what I just wanted to share very quickly, my favorite self-compassion practice that I often do in my private practice with clients, or sometimes even workshops with healthcare providers. We're going to do it here today. It's called the hands on heart practice. So I invite you to try it with me. It's literally just a minute or two. So again, just getting comfortable. If you'd like to close your eyes, please feel free to do so. If you prefer to keep your eyes open, just lower your gaze. That works too. And just taking both hands and placing them over your heart. And again, just breathing comfortably at your own pace. And maybe noticing the feeling of your hands on your chest. You might notice the warmth or the coolness of your hands through your shirt. You may notice your heart beating. Just allowing the hands to rest here on the chest. And we know if we do this for a minimum of 20 seconds, our body naturally produces oxytocin. And oxytocin is the same hormone that's released when we fall in love. It naturally promotes well-being. It promotes a sense of calm. It feels good. And while you're doing this, you might want to offer yourself something that you need in this moment. So it could sound something like, may I feel calm? May I feel loved? May I be patient? Whatever it is that you need right now. Whenever you're feeling ready, just allowing your hands to come back down. And just giving your body a little shake. If your eyes are closed, you reopen your eyes. So taking moments during the day to practice these sorts of things, they don't take a lot of time. I think sometimes people are concerned when they hear about mindfulness or mindfulness meditation or self-compassion practices that this is like, you know, sitting cross-legged on the floor for a 45-minute kind of thing. It doesn't have to be. It could be as simple as that, right? 2 minutes before you enter your next patient or resident's room. You know, it could be 2 minutes in your car if you're a visiting nurse or a volunteer going to someone's house. Just a couple of moments to connect back up with yourself. And the other part about mindfulness and self-compassion, I think that's really important for supporting grieving people, being ourselves or other people that we're supporting, is regulation and co-regulation, right? So if we're not grounded, if we're not, you know, if we're not bringing our whole selves, if we're all over the place mentally, if we're not bringing that, then we're not really going to be there for the other person. I wanted to share this slide with you because I think I think it's an important idea. So this is the work of Lois Tonkin. It's back from 1996, but it's an image for the people who are with us virtually of a bunch of circles. And in the early circles, the entire circle is taken up by a pink ball. And then there are 8 circles on the page. And as time goes on, the pink circle within the circle gets smaller. So, or the circle gets bigger. I think back in the day, people used to sort of feel like our grief shrinks over time, that our grief takes up less of us. Lois Tonkin's work talks about how we grow around our grief, right? But I think the idea remains the same, that when we first experience a death or some other loss, grief is overwhelming. It feels like it's all of us. And then what we notice happens in time, and again, I don't put a particular timeline on that, but over time, we are not just our grief, right? We're able to be other parts of ourselves, and we might even grow, and yeah, we just might notice that we've learned from that experience, and we're richer from a difficult experience. So I'm going to shift gears. I've talked a lot about, or talked mostly about supporting ourselves, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about supporting others. So either, depending on your role in the system, or your role in communities, or your role as a friend, family, caregiver. I'm curious, how comfortable are you discussing loss and grief with others? So if you're not at all comfortable, you can put a 1 in the chat box, or you could raise your hand. Who's not at all comfortable talking about loss and grief? Not a hand went up, okay. Are you moderately comfortable? You could put a number 2, raise your hand. Moderately, yeah, so half, third to half. And you're completely comfortable talking about grief. Okay, again, looks like almost half maybe. Yeah, so I've seen like variations of that. I would say this group seems to be a little more comfortable with grief than most. But I don't think we could ever have these discussions too much, right? The more we talk about it, the more comfortable we get, the more we learn from each other. What I have noticed is that even people who are comfortable talking about grief, there still seems to be a discomfort in asking for help ourselves, right? So we might be comfortable generally having conversations about grief, less so having conversations about our actual feelings, but like, it's a bit of a stumbling block where to go with it, right? Who do we turn to? Who do we ask? I would say for sure in a professional context, maybe we're better in our own personal lives knowing who to connect to for support. But in professional context, some of the work that we did maybe 4 or 5 years ago when we first started working with healthcare providers and grief, we were hearing a lot. We did a series of workshops, 6 workshops in hospice, hospital, and with community nurses. And they said that they didn't want to talk to their colleagues because they were afraid of how that would impact them in their work environment. And then they didn't want to go home and slime their partners or their children. So when we asked, so what are you doing with this? Like, what are you doing with all of your feelings and your grief? They were like, the answer we got back is nothing. So we're hoping slowly that culture is changing, right? The more that we have these conversations. If we had more time together, we might do an exercise thinking of a time you felt supported and how did that feel and how did it come to be, but we're not really going to get into that today. So I'm just going to share a couple of other things, like in terms of supporting others. So if you are open and willing and working in a workplace where you're willing to sort of connect as teams around this, some of the things to be aware of is you need to be in a place to offer support. Right? So again, the mindfulness, checking in, how am I doing? Can I hold other people's grief? Can I hold other people's emotions right now? And then, maybe working on the communication skills to be able to share that. Sometimes we have colleagues knock on our door and they're like, holy crap, I just have to tell you this horrible thing that happened. Right? And we're like, oh no, barely keeping it together, but it's hard to say that, right? So working on those skills to say, I want to be here for you, but maybe we could check back tomorrow because I'm already having a day. Or I wanted to share this. So this again is the work of Dan Siegel, so the psychiatrist, the Name It to Tame It guy. He talks about when we're supporting others. He gives this framework that I really, really like and wanted to share. So he has an acronym PART, P-A-R-T. He says these are things to be mindful of. So our first is presence. The P is our presence. So our presence is our own state of curiosity, openness, acceptance, and love, right? So what are we showing up with? How are we showing up, right? Are we open and curious? The second is attunement, how we're focusing on the internal state of the other person. Are we noticing, do they have energy? Are they low? Like, you know, are we feeling their energy? Are we able to assess where they're at? The third, the R, is resonance. So resonance is how we let our own internal state be impacted by their internal state, right? So if we're sitting with a patient or a client or a resident who's feeling really low or really sad, and we're like cheerful and happy, you know, we're going to miss the mark, right? And not to say that we have to be miserable either, but we have to manage and monitor our own sense of, you know, being an energy to sort of be congruent with theirs. And Dan Siegel says, if we do that, then we get to the T in part, which is we develop trust. Right? So other people will feel that they are heard, they are seen, that we're connecting, they'll have a sense of trust. And then he says the me and the we become a we. So you become sort of a unit, right? Dan Siegel also was the first person to try to define the word mind. And I think it's kind of like as part of our discussion, if we think about mind. So he says mind is not our installed brain. Mind is relational. So he says mind is the information and energy that we have within our bodies, how we manage it and monitor it up and throughout our bodies and then out into the world. So that's very much, you know, in line with this acronym of PART, right? So mind is ourselves, mind is the other. And if we could sort of harness that with another person, that we're creating a trusting environment. And in that, we could really take care of ourselves and then support somebody else who's grieving. A few active listening skills. I'm sure you've all seen lists like this before, but I thought I would just throw it out there. What does active listening look like? Paying attention, listen to what the other person is saying. And here's the trick, without thinking about your response. That's the tricky one, right? We get stuck up in our heads and we're often thinking like, how do I respond to this? This is so heavy. What am I going to say? Leaning in, nodding, smiling when appropriate, being silent. So I love silence. And it's funny, like sometimes when I'm working with volunteers, we get hung up on this point. They're like, how awkward is that? Like, how long should I be silent for? And what should I do when I'm silent? What should I do with my hands? What should I... I'm like, I don't know, but you know, just play around with it, right? Because some of the greatest revelations or some of the greatest, some of the greatest moments come from just sitting, right? Just sitting quietly. It gives people a chance to sort of identify what's happening for them. So if we jump in too quickly with our questions, if we jump in too quickly with, sometimes what we do is we jump in with awkward like platitudes, right? Like, I'm sure we've all heard the things like, at least, at least she didn't suffer any longer. At least you had 25 years together, at least. And we do it well-meaning, right? Other people do it in a well-meaning way, trying to look for a silver lining. I have a little video I'll show you about silver linings, so I'll stop there. But active listening skills, being non-judgmental. And I also like to just remind people to ask for permission for physical contact. Some of us are very huggy or touchy, other people are not, so. Oh, so here's the video. So I wanted to share this video. So this is Megan Devine. She wrote a book called It's Okay to Not Be Okay. And this is a video that is it gonna play, Chelsea? Oh, it's not gonna play. Okay, so that's okay. If it doesn't play, I really encourage you to look it up on YouTube. How do you help a grieving friend? It's a really, really good video. Yeah, I won't say anything more about it. Look it up. It was really well done. So is that it? Oh yeah, thank you. So, okay, what did I do there? 420. So questions? Should we go to questions before I introduce Patty?
Anyone question?
Sure. So, like my private practice in grief, or so I have a private practice in Ottawa that's Cohen Wellness, but I work as a grief therapist with Andrea Warnick Consulting. So it's a team of 22 grief therapists out of Toronto. We're all working virtually now. So I do that. That's kind of my part-time thing, but because I work full-time at the Champlain Hospice Palliative Care Program.
Do you like talk about self-compassion stuff? Do you do any training for that?
Like, do I? So I don't do any trainings. What I do is that before COVID, I haven't done any in person since COVID started. Is I run mindfulness and self-compassion groups. Sometimes I run them for caregivers, and sometimes I run them for people who are living with chronic life-limiting illnesses.
I'm just wondering because it could be great with a lot of the caregivers and feeling burnt out and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always happy to do that. And actually, so from the program, my colleague Carl and I are building an e-learning, he's the computer guy, I don't know, an e-course, that's the word. We're building an e-course on self-compassion, so it could be shared a little more broadly. The other thing I did want to mention is Anne shared the practical caregiving program that my colleague Brittany developed. If you're interested in this material, the program that we're working on now is building this grief program in a way that we could do train the trainers with your organizations. So we're looking for Eastern Ontario champions who would be interested in bringing forth this material, to different groups. So the general public, or if you're working in healthcare settings, if you think your patients or your clients could use, a little bit of grief literacy. This material comes from the first of 3 different sessions. So this one is really around literacy. The second module is around Alan Wolfelt's work on companioning the bereaved and trauma-informed approaches to supporting grief. And then the third module is all around facilitation, like how to facilitate grief groups. We're good?
Yeah.
Excellent. So thanks everybody for listening. Feel free to get in touch if you are interested in talking about grief. And I wanted to take just a moment here to introduce Patty. Patty is going to share some really positive, good news for all of you in the region, in this part of the region, about grief and bereavement supports. So,
Welcome, Patty.
there you go, Patty.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you very much, Tara. And I'll definitely need your business card because we just have been welcomed by the Toronto BFO to become a satellite in Lanark County. So we're so happy.
What is that?
BFO is the Bereaved Families of Ontario. It's a volunteer program that's throughout Ontario. There are, I think, 11 chapters. And they are people who have trained to support the bereaved. So we hold closed groups, which is just a small group, 8 to 10 people. And we do some one-on-one, and we do community events to support the bereaved. So I'm just going to start by saying, well, thank you, Tara, for introducing me. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for the wonderful work you do. And I just came in late. I was working this morning, but I came in on the MAID discussion. And I want to say that if any of you know celebrants, or I'm a life cycle celebrant, but there are people out there willing to do a ceremony for people who choose MAID. And it is a very sacred time for the family and the dying person. So if you're serving people, keep that in mind if they have that lean, that can help everyone. So I won't take much of your time today. I know everybody's on a clock and it's the end of the day, but I am thrilled to say that we are going to be under the satellite of BFO. We were offering closed groups and support in the bereavement with the Lanark County Community Home Support Office with Rebecca Bowie, and then COVID came. This year we had an opportunity to get some training with Healthy Morning. Now we know of an even closer training that's going to be available, so that's good. A lot of the same concepts. And Healthy Morning is by Maria Klavkov, and she trained under Alan Wolfelt, and she gave us 3 certifications, and they included basics of bereavement, and that was mostly the companioning component, complicated traumatic and pandemic grief support. And our 3rd certification was in the group facilitation for bereavement programs. So those were very in-depth. We did a lot of self-journey on our own grief journey. As Maria said, you can't go any further with another person, and you know, you can only go as far as you've gone yourself in your own grief journey. So we also have, a number of us have trained with the Bereaved Families of Ontario and the HPCO, and we have other facilitation and group dynamic experience. So it's a solid group. During the course of our studies, though, Community Home Support realized that they didn't have the staffing or the mandate to support a community bereavement program. So I started to reach out. I reached out to Kingston BFO, Bereaved Families, and then the Ottawa chapter to see if we could become a satellite. We're a very rural group, and there were 14 of us took the training. And so we were just looking for an umbrella to come under. And they both thought it was a great idea. They would have loved to have had us, but they're all volunteers, swamped, and they're both revamping their programs and their board of directors. So, but we did luck out because our conversations eventually included Jane Smart, who's with the Overreaching Bereaved Families of Ontario. And she's also a director with the Toronto chapter. And she just went to bat for us. She believes so much in the work that she convinced Toronto to let us come under their chapter, at least temporarily, until we can stand on our own 2 feet. So we'll benefit greatly from that. So there's 14 of us. We gathered a couple of weeks ago at Lennon's Funeral Home in Smith Falls and talked about what we want to do with the program, what we want to offer. Lots of great things, lots of good energy. Jane Smart joined in the meeting and told us what BFO wants from us and what we can get from them. And so there's lots of things coming for the Lanark County area. Closed groups, monthly check-ins, community events, info nights in the spring, small walking bereavement groups, and a men's group. We're hoping to get a men's group going. So lots of support, and we're hoping to hit Smith Falls, Carleton Place, Perth, and Lanark. On December 12th, we're going to host a afternoon of remembrance at Lennon's Funeral Home in Smith Falls. It's at 2 o'clock, and we have a Facebook page now, so you can go on there and find us, but it's BFO Lanark County. And so that event is for those who wish to honor their dead, to remember their dead, to speak their names during the season of lots of holiday joy and cheer. And of course, everything we do will require vaccine proof and masks. We're on December 14th, we're starting a closed group again at Lannon's. As you can see, Lannon's is extremely supportive. They don't charge us for the use of their facilities. They've just invited us in to do so many things, and we're so grateful to them. But we're going to start a small closed group on the 14th in person. Rita Jackson and myself will facilitate. And there are no charges, sometimes goodwill offerings if there's a cost to us, but we will do some fundraising and looking for grants. And if anybody has any suggestions, please email me with them. We'd love to hear. There's registration on the Facebook page or they can telephone, they can call me to register for the closed group or the afternoon of remembrance. We do ask people to register for COVID reasons as well as preparation. We're also hoping to have events, down the road, maybe a butterfly release. We've researched the environmental impact of that. We're very careful about that. The services we provide are good, again, no cost. We're looking for donations, grants. Many of our participants are seniors, so we'll look for funding in those areas too. And I'm really glad I brought notes today because I wrote down so much of what you said, Tara, and I look forward to connecting with you. And I think line dancing for the bereaved might be a really good event from your mom's story. That sounds wonderful. And maybe a bereavement group for our people who are in the healthcare, just for you, so that you can maybe mingle with people you don't work with, but who get you, and we can sit and honor that space with you. So that's my shtick. I have my name and phone number here on, and just our website, which is still under construction, and our Facebook, if anybody's interested. But if you know anyone that might benefit from a closed group in person, we may do some on Zoom too. But it is starting December 14th. So if you know somebody, yes?
Do you have a referral process from the hospital?
Well, we're just starting. So we're networking with people. We do have somebody who volunteers in the hospital in Perth. So yeah, we're just kind of getting the word out. We have some email lists that we'll send it out. We're just trying to let people, hear about us. So yeah, spread the word. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone.